What's up, Buckeye fans? Welcome to another episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. I'm Patrick Murphy, and we are going to talk Ohio State heading into the spring game. This episode, a fun episode, I think we should have here because I want to talk position battles, and there's going to be a lot of them for this team because of the number of guys that left the program after winning a national championship. So this spring is actually, I think, one of the more interesting ones I've covered just because of the sheer number of questions. Dave Biddle and I did the Bucknuts Morning Five this morning and talked about the questions that Ohio State faces this spring. And some of them were more, you can listen to it, but some of them were not as much questions as just discussion on certain positions, certain players, things like that. But there's certainly a lot of intrigue. So I think we have plenty to talk about with spring practice starting on Monday. Pretty excited to get back out there, even though it feels like, we were just in Atlanta and we were just over at the Horseshoe celebrating the Buckeyes winning the national title. If you would not mind giving this a like, subscribe, whatever platform you're listening to this on, watching this on. And if you have any questions, if you're watching this live, feel free to throw those in the chat. We will get to some of those later if stuff comes up throughout. I also try and talk a little Buckeye hoops towards the end. Obviously, Ohio State got bounced from the Big Ten tournament, and there's a lot of questions about what's happening. And literally, as we're sitting here, I see that Iowa has fired Fran McCaffrey, Iowa's coach, who beat the Buckeyes. So that's happening as we talk. But the most important thing, frankly, is what we're drinking today. And I took a bunch of beer to actually a crew tailgate, and so I didn't have as many options. So I found this Sun Cruiser iced tea vodka in the refrigerator. It's the nicest day yet in 2025. I was like, oh, this might be tasty. I'm not sure if I'm going to like it or not, but let's give it a whirl. I assume my fiance bought this or somebody brought it over at some point, but let's see. Oh, not bad. Not bad at all. Definitely tastes iced tea. Yeah, that's one I could drink on a nice warm day like today outside. Anyway, let's get into the Buckeye talk and the position battles. Again, if you have questions as we go, or even if it pertains to something we don't talk about, feel free to throw those in the chat if you're watching this live. I want to start with the most obvious position battle, and that's at quarterback. Will Howard, great season. We'll see what he ends up doing in the NFL draft and in his professional career. But no doubt you can't fault Will Howard for much of anything last season. Even played through when he probably shouldn't have been on the field against Michigan. So the Buckeyes have big shoes to replace in terms of the quarterback position. And that's not just, arm talent and whatnot, but Will Howard's leadership. Ryan Day talked about that quite a bit. The reason that they huddled as much as they did, things like that. So I think, sorry, I was just, something popped up on my computer screen there. I think that this position is interesting. This battle is interesting for a number of reasons, because not only do you have to replace Will Howard, you have some interesting candidates to replace him. I think with Julian Sayin, Lincoln Kienholz, and then Aaron Nolan coming in as well. Tavian St. Clair. Aaron Nolan departed the program this offseason. So how does this go? I think the assumption by nearly everyone is that Julian Sayin is going to win this job. If I were a betting man and this were something to bet on, that's probably the direction I would go. Julian Sayin, former 5-star prospect, one of the top prospects in the country at any position, coming out of high school just over a year ago, was at Alabama very briefly before Nick Saban retires, transfers to Ohio State, was in the quarterback competition last year. I think people kind of forget that because he wasn't talked about as much, but Ryan Day said it. I mean, those were his words that, Julian Sayin was in the mix. And when we were out at practices during fall camp, we saw some things that was like, okay, this kid definitely has the talent to, live up to that billing. I think for me, it was always kind of a matter of like, all right, you have this national championship level team. Are you going to hand the keys over to a freshman when you also had this senior who's played a lot of football come in? And obviously Ohio State went with the veteran Will Howard, which I think everyone expected, but impressive nonetheless that a guy like Julian Sayin can come in and within a few months of being on campus, get himself into that quarterback competition, with Will Howard, with Devin Brown. So there's a reason that he is the favorite to win the job. But I do think this will be a legitimate competition. And I think Lincoln Kienholz has abilities and has gotten better in his 2 years at Ohio State. He's also the most veteran guy in that room, which plays a part. He's been with this coaching staff longer. He has been in this playbook. The coaches know him. Do I think that ultimately results in him winning the job? No, probably not. But I also don't think we should completely dismiss the idea that Lincoln Kienholz could be the starter for Ohio State and could do a good job. I think a lot of people just assume that he won't win the job and he'll transfer. I talked to him at the Rose Bowl, I think it was, or before the Rose Bowl. And, he acknowledged that path is potentially there if things don't go the way he would like. And he didn't say that in a negative way, just obviously like all quarterbacks, he knows one quarterback's going to play. He wants to play. But the kid has gotten better. And I know that there are people in that building that really like what Lincoln Kienholz gives to an offense. But I think those two are really the guys. I think Tavian St. Clair, as talented as he may be, I think it's like most freshman quarterbacks, you're going to need time. And, is he the future at quarterback for Ohio State? Quite possibly. I want to see more of him doing it in a college offense, be it in practice or if he gets opportunities in games than what he did in high school playing at Bellefontaine. But when he's played, 7-on-7 and things like that I've seen, I've been really impressed. So I think there is a future there. But for me, it's going to come down to, unless something crazy happens, Julian Sayin, Lincoln Kienholz. I think ultimately Julian wins out. But again, I wouldn't count out Lincoln Kienholz. The athleticism, his focus on football has changed significantly since he's been at Ohio State. He could focus solely on football where he was a 3-sport athlete. But that shows you his athletic ability. Ohio State fans didn't really get a chance to see that when he got to play most of the snaps in the Cotton Bowl because he was playing behind an offensive line that just couldn't block anyone. But that is part of his game that is interesting. And if the rest of it can come along, his arm, his understanding of the game, which is both things he's worked on, I think that that there is a possibility there. But I think this is a competition that by the end of spring, we won't have an answer. Ryan Day will kind of follow the same playbook he has in other offenses. Cheers. In other off seasons, I should say. And this will carry over in the fall camp. I think you'll hear a lot of good things about both guys. I think most people will probably still think Julian Sayin is going to be the guy coming out of spring, and then we'll see how it goes in the fall camp. I would be surprised if it's not Julian Sayin, as I think most people are when Ohio State opens against Texas. But I did want to address that because I do think there's just this assumption. It's like, wait, Lincoln Kienholz is a pretty good player as well. And that's not to dismiss Tavian St. Clair. I just think he needs some time in a college offense. Next up, running back. I think this one's going to be pretty straightforward. You brought in CJ Donaldson. You have James Peoples, who played some last season, and those are the guys that I think Carlos Lachlan will look at to be, not the same as what Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson were this past year, because I think they're different types of players. But, that same idea of a duo that can do some different things. They can come in for each other, keep each other fresh for a longer season. For me, that's the recipe for success that Carlos Lachlan found. Now, could a third guy work his way in to that equation? It's possible. You saw Sam Williams-Dixon enter the transfer portal during the Buckeyes playoff run and then ultimately decide to stay at Ohio State. he's an interesting player because of some of his, we talked about athleticism with Lakin Keenholz, some of the things he can do, with the ball in his hands and different ways you could get him the ball, the comparisons with Curtis Samuel. Cheers, Curtis Samuel. When Williams Dixon was coming out of high school are there for a reason. So, could you figure out a way to have, okay, CJ Donaldson and James People are your two predominant running backs, but then we have these, we have like this H-back or whatever you want to call it role for a guy like Sam Williams Dixon. Do one of the freshmen get involved? I would be, could one of them have a role? Could a guy like Bo Jackson, just because of his physical stature, could he figure out a way in? I know that Carlos Lachlan is very high on Anthony Turbo Rogers. But for me, because you already have two guys with more experience, you have Sam Williams Dixon coming back. Unless you really need a third guy or one of these guys, and Bo Jackson and Isaiah West are the two freshmen that enrolled early at running back. So if one of those two really forces his way in there, maybe you could see a three running back system. I'm not sure if Carlos Laughlin's ever done that. I know he likes to have the two backs. I don't know if he's ever gone as deep as three regularly, but I think if a guy earns the right to be on the field, you don't just hold him off because, we only run two running backs, right? So I think there's a chance that one of those guys works their way in, but I think the most likely scenario is a lot of what we saw last year with, Quinton Judkins, Travion Henderson. It'll look different. I don't think they're the same players. I don't want to sound like that, but I think you have two talented guys and they can do some different things. They can also do some of the same stuff like you saw with Trey and Quinchon last year. Wide receiver, I don't think we really need to touch on that. The real only position that's open is the slot role that Emeka Egbuka vacated. Everyone, I think, is pretty aware that is going to go to a guy like to Brandon Inniss, and I don't think there's much debate there. What is Mylan Graham's role? Bryson Rogers, guys like that. That's to be figured out, but I don't think that is necessarily any sort of position battle. I think those top three are pretty well locked in. Offensive line, though, I do think you have some interesting questions to be asked. And you have three guys coming back who started in the national championship game, four guys, if you count that rotation. So you've got Carson Hinsman, who started at center. You've got Luke Montgomery, who started at left guard, Tegra Shabola, right guard, and then Austin Sareveld, who rotated in as well. And Austin Sareveld started games during the season. So what does that look like when you have four guys in three positions? And then there's Josh Padilla, who could work his way in at center. Do you move Carson Hinsman? Can any of those guys move out to tackle? I think those are things that Ohio State will look at during spring practice. Who can kind of fit in where? What is the best scenario? And then at the tackle spots, you've got Ethan Onyanwa from Rice, who came in. A lot of people have already penned him in as the left tackle option. And then Philip Daniels, a lot of people think he'll be Ohio State's right tackle. I think that there is plenty of room for competition in this across the offensive line. Cheers. I think that, and this is what you want. This is how they created depth last year with the way they had to with the injuries. Now it's a matter of how does this all fit together for the 2025 version? And remember, you have a new set of eyes looking at the offensive linemen. You have Tyler Bowen taking over for Justin Fry. So that doesn't mean that he will, he could see something and say, just an example, a Carson Hinsman, and say, okay, well, maybe Josh Padilla can come in at center. And I like this from what I saw of Carson Hinsman at guard. And maybe I think that, Luke Montgomery, Tager, whoever it is, maybe he can do some stuff at tackle instead of playing guard and things like that. I do think that Ethan Onyanwa is the most likely guy to take over at left tackle after Josh Simmons, Zen Mikowski, Donovan Jackson combo last season. You also have the Armstrong brothers that will work their way in there. Ian Moore certainly is a guy who could see more time or work his way in. I think aside from the 4 guys for potentially 3 interior offensive line spots, big question for me is that right tackle spot. And is Philip Daniels ready to play, Ohio State level tackle spots? I know he started at the end of last season for Minnesota. I know that people at Minnesota were high on his future, but they were not expecting to play Philip Daniels as early as he was. I think it was his redshirt freshman year. So now he comes to Ohio State, which is, still the Big Ten, but a step up, I would say. And you're asking him to be your starting right tackle. Is he ready for that? I know people at Minnesota, people who've covered Minnesota that I've talked to, have said they were a bit surprised that Ohio State was that interested in Daniels, especially, as a guy that they would possibly want to come in and play right away. I think there is some thought that he may need a year or two. So right tackle will certainly be a spot to watch throughout spring. Is Philip Daniels ready to be that guy with the experience he had? Is it Ian Moore? Is it one of the Armstrong twins? You got Carter Lowe, a true freshman, coming in. That's a bit harder for me to believe, but I think there are a lot of questions that need to be answered on this offensive line. As I said on the Bucknuts Morning 5, I do think you're in a better spot than you were a year ago, where there were a lot of questions. Now you've got guys that can do the job. It's just figuring out who goes where and who's ready for what. But again, with a new guy coming in to coach the position, new eyes, you've got some new assistant offensive line coaches, guys that analysts or GAs or whatever we're calling them, that will also be analyzing this for the first time. Anytime you have new guys stepping in on the offensive line, I think it is a big part of the offseason. It's just such a crucial part of the offense. So, but then, coming off of national championship where you had that offensive line play the way it did with all the injuries, now it's even more interesting, I think, just to figure out who goes where. If I had to guess, if I had to predict, and this will probably change throughout the offseason, throughout spring, even into fall camp, I would guess Onion was your left tackle day one. I think it's probably a toss-up on the three guys that could play guard between Montgomery, Saraveld, and Shabola in terms of who starts. Tyler Bowen was asked about the rotation and, admitted that it worked. I don't know if he would want to do that going in. I was high on Tegra Shabola early last season, and then I thought he sort of regressed a little bit, though he did continue to play and performed well in the playoff. It wouldn't surprise me if Luke Montgomery and Austin Saraveld get a shot to be the two guards. But Tegra certainly has the opportunity to continue to grow this offseason, as do them. And then unless you have a reason to move Carson Hinsman, I would keep Carson Hinsman in there. The guy just helped you win a national championship at center. Joshua Padilla, I know they're very high on. If he's ready to step in, fine. But also, one more year behind Carson Hinsman, being able to come in if needed at times, and then knowing he's the guy next season after Carson Hinsman goes to the NFL, that's the way I would do it. At right tackle, again, Daniels probably, since the Buckeyes got him, but I think he needs to have a big offseason to show he's ready for that. Or do you go with a redshirt freshman Ian Moore or someone like that, who hasn't played as much as Daniels, but was a guy who Ohio State recruited out of high school. So as you can tell there, I can give some predictions, but I still have questions about the offensive line. Again, if you have questions, whether they're position battle related or otherwise, feel free to throw those in the chat if you're watching live, and we'll get to any of those towards the end. The other offensive position, and we'll get to defense in a second, is tight end. And this one is not obviously as interesting to most Buckeye fans, just because Ohio State doesn't use the tight end in the pass game the way other programs do. But certainly still, I think, a position to watch with G. Scott leaving the program, heading to the NFL. You've got some options at that spot. And look, it's still, even if they don't catch a ton of passes, it's still an important position. The Buckeyes brought in Max Clare from Purdue, a guy who had a really good season, an all Big Ten season last year, playing in a Purdue offense, which is obviously not nearly as explosive. He caught 51 passes for 685 yards and 4 touchdowns last season. For me, it's really a matter of how the Buckeyes are going to use him. He was not a great blocker. He was a good enough blocker, but that's something he will have to improve. And then you've got Will Kazmarek coming back. I think he was a bit shortchanged with the injuries last year. That's a guy I think can be your 1A, number 2 tight end, similar to his role last year, though I think it will expand. Jelani Thurman is still there. If Jelani Thurman's not in the mix at the end of spring, is he still around after spring practice and heading into the fall? Like, this is an uber talented kid that hasn't seen a lot of playing time. Bennett Christian played some last season as well. So I think there's a good mix there. I assume, given that you went out and got Max Clare from the transfer portal, that will be your guy as, your starting tight end, and you try and get him into the mix a bit more in the pass game. I think Will Kazmarek will certainly be a part of it. And again, I think if you want to keep Jelani Thurman in this program, you got to find a role for him. I was a bit surprised that the Buckeyes went out and got a guy like Max Clare. Yes, more proven than a guy like Jelani Thurman, but just raw natural ability, Jelani Thurman jumps off the page. Now, Ryan Day, Keenan Bailey, they see these guys every day. So clearly they must see something in Jelani or not have seen something with Jelani that has kept him from getting on the field now 2 years in. He's played, let's take a look here. Jelani played 165 snaps, offensive snaps last year. He played in almost every game, but no more than 26 snaps that he played in week 2. So he didn't play in the Rose Bowl despite blowing Oregon out. So this is a guy that I've liked since they were recruiting him. I'd like to see him play more, but again, we're not at practice every day. It's, there clearly is something that's not happening with Jelani Thurman. The consistency, maybe, the blocking side of things. I'm not sure. Clearly enough that Ohio State felt good about going to get Max Clare, a guy I imagine took some NIL money. I don't know that, but I would guess. So I would think Max Clare is your number 1 tight end, kind of taking over that G. Scott role. And then you have Will Kazmarek kind of coming in and doing some of the stuff he did this past season. That would be my guess on that battle. Okay. Defensively, there are a lot because you lost 8 starters from the national championship defense, and you lost all 4 on the defensive line, right? Which you don't see that happen all that often. And look, you don't see those guys return the way they did. All 4 defensive linemen, upperclassmen, could have gone to the NFL, decided to all come back. So, Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Tyleik Williams, Ty Hamilton, all off to the NFL. And then Hero Kanu, who played quite a bit last year, 123 snaps, which was the 5th most at defensive tackle, leaves to go to Texas, which I don't think Hero Kanu was quite ready to be a starter yet, but certainly somebody who would have been in the rotation on the interior. The 2 guys that I think are clearly most likely to win the starting jobs there on the interior of the defensive line, Caden McDonald and Edric Houston. Apologies. They played a good amount last season. Caden McDonald played 214 snaps. Edric Houston played 141. And remember, Edric Houston, freshman last year, was sort of making the transition from defensive end to defensive tackle. So, it wasn't, he didn't come in and start right away. That wasn't the position he played in high school all the time. So those two seem to be, 214. 214 snaps for Caden McDonald, 141 for Edric Houston. Not sure if I said that right. As I was looking there, I think those two, to me, you've got your starters. Now you got to find depth, and that's kind of a different topic. And that's really probably where more of the position battle will be this offseason. Who are the depth guys? Jason Moore, Tywan Malone, Will Smith, Eric Mensah. You look at that. Are any of those guys ready to really push? Probably not. That's why I think the starters are what they are on the defensive line or at defensive tackle. And on the ends, I think it's also pretty obvious, at least starter-wise, Caden Curry, Kenyatta Jackson, they've waited their turn. They're both fourth-year guys, played behind Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau the last 3 seasons. I think they're ready to have their opportunity, and they deserve it. Again, I think the battles there are really more with the backups. Ohio State brought in, Logan George from Idaho State. Is that a guy who can contribute right away? He's obviously jumping up. I talked about Philip Daniels going from Minnesota to apologize. My dog is barking in the background. Going from Minnesota to Ohio State. Well, from Idaho State to Ohio State is an even bigger jump. Is he ready? That's something to watch during spring. CJ Hicks moving to an edge rusher more so than a linebacker, at least doing some more of that. What does that mean for the look of the defensive line? Will they do more stand-up stuff? Will they use him as a true defensive end? I think people will be talking a lot about what they see from CJ Hicks throughout spring practice, those of us at Bucknuts included. Josh Mickens, Dominic Kirks. How does this rotation all play out? Because I do think Larry Johnson, while it may look different, they may do some more 3-down lineman stuff in 2024. You're going to need depth. Larry Johnson obviously likes to rotate. So you've got an interesting group beyond those 2 starters. And then how much do you play the starters? If you look at last year, it was very heavily Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau. Jack Sawyer played 697 snaps. JT Tuimoloau played 664, and then Kenyatta Jackson played 314. So like half as much almost. Cheers. So, do you trust Kenyatta Jackson, Caden Curry to play as much as Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau did? Are the backups good enough to force their way in? Who are the backups? And kind of what are their roles? That, to me, is where the position battles really are for the defensive ends. Linebacker, I think that's pretty straightforward. Sonny Styles will be back. Arvell Reese is stepping in to replace Cody Simon. Peyton Pierce is a name that James Laurinaitis brought up as kind of the third guy, or if they were to use 3 linebackers at times. I think, and I said this with Dave on the BM5 today, is Sonny Styles still your will linebacker? And then Arvell Reese just steps in as the Mike. As Laurinaitis pointed out, Sonny started last year at Mike because Cody Simon was out. So, what works best there? I think that's something I'll be watching. But I think for the most part, these, you kind of know what you're going to get there with Pierce as the third linebacker. Garrick Stover's a guy, some of the young guys keep an eye on, but I don't think that they really factor in unless something changes. Maybe if CJ Hicks is kind of going back and forth, he could have something to say in the linebacker rotation as well. But I think it'll be a lot like last year where it's predominantly Sonny Styles, Arvell Reese at that spot. Cornerback, I think the outside guys are set. You've got Davison Igbenogson coming back. All the story about him going up. I think it's an important offseason for him, even though I don't think he will do a ton and obviously has a lot of experience. You can read that on Bucknuts probably before this is published if you're not watching this live. And then Jermaine Matthews Jr., with the way he kind of forced his way into a 3-man rotation the second half of last season. Cheers. Good work, Jermaine. There's no question in my mind that he is the other outside corner. The real competition, I think, at corner, if you want to call it that, is the nickel spot, the slot corner, whatever name you want to give it. Lorenzo Styles Jr. is the most obvious guy to step in because he played 161 snaps last year, which was the fourth most of the corners. And he came in on those dime packages in that slots position, stepped in for Jordan Hancock when he came out of games, things like that. So that would be the obvious guy. But do you, is he ready to be a full-time, Jordan Hancock did a lot of good things for this team, probably went super underrated playing that spot, and the ability he had to drop in as a third safety, things like that. It opened up a lot. Is Lorenzo Styles ready to do that? It's, remember, he was a wide receiver at Notre Dame before he transferred to Ohio State 2 years ago. And also, are you still doing those same things? With Matt Patricia calling the defense, and I think the base will still be the same, the principles will still be the same, but Matt Patricia, will have his ideas based on the personnel. So is that position still what it was with Jordan Hancock? I think that is up for debate, but I think Lorenzo Styles will be pushed there. You've got Aaron Scott Jr., you've got Bryce West, you've got these guys that are young and exciting cornerbacks that are looking to get on the field. And, I think every cornerback, like growing up, you dream of being that outside guy one-on-one with the top receiver, right? Your Marshawn Lattimore type of player when he was in his heyday, Denzel Ward, those guys. But that slot corner has become pretty important. And if you have the ability to play with those guys, if you're Aaron Scott, if you're Bryce West, you have that ability. It's a chance to get on the field. You're probably not forcing your way on with Igbinosun and Matthews back. So could that be a way to earn your way into more playing time? And I think that certainly is a path for either of those guys. I think, a guy like Devin Sanchez, I would assume probably stays on the outside early on in his career, maybe shifts into the middle if they need him to. Honestly, Tim Walton talked about that Davison Igbinosun has done some stuff in the slot before. I don't think that's something that the Buckeyes would do a lot of. I think you just keep your outside guys. But yeah, I think Lorenzo Styles, probably the most likely guy, but I think of the positions we've talked about where there is a guy who played the position coming back, like that's the one I feel least confident in saying that. And it's not on a slight on Lorenzo Styles. I thought he actually did a very good job when he came in. It's that you've got two really talented young cornerbacks who are going to push and have a chance to jump over you on the depth chart. And, I think anytime you have that, and it's not like Lorenzo Styles is the returning starter. He's a guy who played some snaps last year. So I think that may be one of the more up in the air positions, which leads us to another up in the air position, and that is at safety. Obviously you have Caleb Downs coming back. He's the guy, as Dave and I talked about, like what a luxury to have. Cheers to Lorenzo Styles, or to Caleb Downs. Sorry. A luxury to have him back in his third year in college, second year in this program, a guy that can do a lot, and you'll have a first-time starter next to him. I think you feel a lot more comfortable as that first-time starter when you're playing next to Caleb Downs, right? You got a guy who can talk to you and kind of make sure everything's going the way it's supposed to. So I think the two that will compete the most there are Jalen McClain and Malik Hartford. And it's been interesting to kind of watch the backup safety position because if you remember 2 years ago, like there was a lot of buzz going into the season about Malik Hartford. And he even started one of those early season games, had some struggles, ended up not playing a ton, but there was still a lot of positivity surrounding him. And then Jalen McClain has this really good offseason last year and kind of forces his way up the depth chart. You look at the two in terms of the snaps they played: 106 to Jalen McClain, 94 to Malik Hartford. Those are the third and fourth most snaps at the safety position. So not a big discrepancy there. But I think if you'd asked people 2 years ago if they thought Malik Hartford was definitely the next guy at safety, who has said, yeah, but then Jalen McClain kind of forces his way into that position. And I would not be surprised if Jalen McClain is your opening day starter next to Caleb Downs. I also wouldn't be surprised if this is a bit of a rotation at that position going into the season. We've seen that in the past when you have two guys that maybe bring you some different things, kind of both have good off seasons. Maybe neither one really won the job. Okay, yes, somebody's going to start, no doubt about that. But do you rotate these guys a little bit, especially when you have a guy like Downs, which gives you a lot of comfort at the back end of the defense. So I think that spot is definitely up for grabs. And then, I know we don't talk about it a lot, but punter, I think is interesting because you didn't, statistically last year, you didn't have the best punting with Joe McGuire. I thought, he continued to develop. And if you remember last offseason, he was a guy who, former walk-on, not a guy who a lot of people talked about. And then all of a sudden, week one, he's the punter, an Australian, so has kind of gone through some of the things, but not who I expected to be punting, especially as the season went on. And then he was the guy basically the entire year. You have Nick McClarty, another Australian who you brought in last offseason, 6'7", 255 pounds. We saw him boom some punts during fall camp. We also saw him really shank some punts. So that to me is an interesting, and Anthony Veneri, who they also brought in from the transfer portal, played at Buffalo. I think that's an area where Ohio State could be better. If Nick McClarty can be consistent, I think that's a guy that you really like his leg. He needs to be, as I said, more consistent, be able to do some of the pooching of the punts. I thought when we saw them before the Rose Bowl, when we got to practice, I liked the fact I thought he had improved in that capacity. So, not a position that we talk about a ton in terms of position battles, but I do think that there will be one there, and a position that could be more important. We'll see. I still expect this Ohio State offense to be very good this season, but I also know that you got a new quarterback, you got new offensive lineman, you got new running backs, you got a new receiver, like new tight end. So maybe it's not quite as explosive, and you do need to pin teams deep more often and let your defense do some things. We'll see, but certainly a position battle that I felt like we should address. All right. Let me see. I haven't done a good job of monitoring the chat here. Let me see if you guys have had any questions. Rick Montoya saying we'll need to be a leader. Yeah, that is something that came up quite a bit when we were at the NFL Combine, and former players were being asked about, saying was, that's something he could be more vocal and whatnot. That was talked about with some of the coaching staff, and I don't think many people were that concerned about it. Like, as you step into a bigger role, when Will Howard leaves, naturally guys will step up, and the belief was saying will do that. But yes, I think certainly he will need to. Doug Shepard said, I hope Lincoln stays if he isn't named the starter. Day won't name a starter in the spring, but the players know Sang could get hurt and they will need a backup that knows the offense. Yeah, absolutely. And I think Lincoln probably would, unless there is a very obvious situation where he could go and be a starter. He still has time. This is redshirt sophomore season coming up, so definitely has time. And also if he does leave, Ohio State's not in a good spot. You only have 3 scholarship quarterbacks already. One guy goes, you're down to 2, and then you're kind of getting desperate and looking in the transfer portal. So, I think Doug makes a good point there that you would hope whoever loses that job stays in and continues to work. Thanks to my guy Kevin Noon there. Shout out. Matt Randall says, what about the Armstrong twins? Yeah, I think they could be a factor in terms of the offensive line. Still young. They were guys that, I think coming in, you knew there was going to be some development needed there, like there are with a lot of offensive linemen. So I think they are still in the process of that. But yeah, you're going to get to a point at some point where it's either you're good enough to be on the field or you're not. And, I think they have certainly, they look the part. I think from what we've seen of them, they've definitely made progress. So, is it this year? I don't know, but we will see. Let me see if there was anything else. Matt Randall said, would like for us to look at the portal for some D tackles because long season. Yeah. Ryan Day, I think Dave Biddle actually asked about the transfer portal, and Ryan Day went on a tangent about, the schedule and how unfortunate that is. It does sound like they will at least explore options in the spring window. We'll see what's available. I mean, you can only do so much, right? Guys have to enter the portal, but that's certainly a position where you might look to find some added depth. I think, maybe another quarterback, if you can find a guy who's willing to come in and not be the starter and maybe not even be the backup, but just kind of provide you some depth like they've had in the past. Matt Reynolds says, worry about saying not for accuracy, but for size, strength, and durability. Hope St. Clair will also be ready long season. Yeah, I mean, he is not the tallest. Apologies. My dog is mad because there's another dog walking by. This is the beauty of doing this at home. Sayan is 6'1", 203 pounds. So, yeah, he's not the biggest guy, but he's not the smallest guy either. Height-wise, I think you'd like him to be maybe a little bit taller, but I think, he's a guy, I've stood next to him, talking to him, and he's a big kid in terms of the way he's filled out and whatnot. Any quarterback could certainly get hurt during a season, no doubt about that. I don't think that it's a major concern. I don't think Ohio State's going to use him a ton in the run game. I think, maybe, scramble here or there to get out of things. But you saw even with a guy like Will Howard last year, who was much more comfortable running, they didn't use him very much. So, yeah, I mean, there's always a concern, but, I don't think it's anything that crazy. I'm trying to look up, what was JT Barrett listed as? There we go. So he was 6'2", 220, so not that different. And obviously Barrett did have the broken ankle, but other than that, he was pretty healthy. Steve asked, Chris Henry Jr. visited Oregon yesterday. Do you think his commitment sticks? Yes, absolutely. As long as Brian Hartline's on the staff and, he just got promoted, I guess. I'm not sure what we're referring to that as, since he's been the offensive coordinator and the offensive coordinator. As long as he's here, I believe it was like with Jeremiah Smith, as long as Hartline's involved, you are safe with these receivers for the most part. So look, he's going to take his visits. Why would you not? If people were offering you a chance to go around for free to these different schools and see all the facilities and watch practice and all that, I think you'd probably take it too, even if you're the biggest of Buckeye fans. So I do not have any concerns about that as long as Hartline remains employed by the Buckeyes. Okay, we'll end with some short hoops talk, just because, it is appearing to be the end of a season. There is a chance that this team still gets in the NCAA tournament. I think it's a small chance. I think they needed to at least beat Iowa, maybe beat Illinois to get in. So let's just assume for the sake of this conversation that the Buckeyes do not get into the NCAA tournament, don't sneak their way in with an at-large bid. Is it a good season for Jake Diebler in his first full season as head coach? No. And I think Jake Diebler would tell you that. He's made it clear that he wants the standard to be higher at Ohio State. And I think the NCAA tournament is the standard at basically, it should be a minimum, right? This is a program that should be getting in the NCAA tournament. Maybe every few years you have a bad season and you don't quite get in, or you're on the bubble and something like this season happens. But it's been too long and too many times that they've not gotten in now. They haven't been in the tournament, assuming they don't get in, since 2002. I think I like Jake Diebler. I want to say that. I think when Ross Bjork decided to go with a first-time head coach, there's going to be growing pains, and you're going to have to ride through that. I know there are Buckeye fans that don't believe he was the right guy for the job, and you can make that argument. I think it's too early to tell, but there are going to be some teething issues with a first-time head coach, and I think you saw that at times this year. I think they set themselves up in a not a bad way, but the roster, the way that it was constructed, bringing in the two former five-star centers, complicated the way that Jake Diebler wants to play offense, because it meant you lost Felix Akpara, which I don't think there was anybody that upset about, because there was the hope that Aaron Bradshaw would develop into a guy, rim running center, athletic center. Sean Stewart could be a center or a four. And, maybe those two play together some, maybe they play separate some, but you had two guys there. And you could still play that tempo. Remember the way that the Buckeyes were playing the end of last year under Diebler. It was fast. It was transition. You were shooting threes, like things like that. And you didn't see a lot of that this year because the roster didn't make sense to do it as much. And, I asked Diebler about it a couple of times, and, I didn't get a great answer. But, you just look at it and you compare it to what you saw last year, and you just don't have the guys to do that. And they didn't even really have it last year. Jake Diebler kind of forced it with some of the guys. Felix Akpara is not the ideal center for that either, but he does give you rim protection, which is something Aaron Bradshaw didn't. I just think this roster was not set up well. And I think that's something that this staff will have to learn is they had the opportunity to go get these former five-star guys. And I think, say what you will, if you're a coach and you're like, we don't look at that. Well, you know who these guys are. You know their names. They're McDonald's All-Americans, like that. I think the eyes got big, and it's like, all right. And you didn't look as much at why didn't it work at Kentucky? Why didn't it work at Duke? And I'm not saying that this coaching staff didn't do their homework, because they certainly did, but it didn't work. Maybe if Aaron Bradshaw were available more, didn't have the issue at the beginning of the season where he was suspended for 7 games, I think it was, and those two get to play together more, maybe you find something with Aaron Bradshaw at center, Sean Stewart at the 4, because Sean Stewart at the 4 just didn't work in Big Ten play, or at the 5, didn't work at Big Ten play. He's not big enough. He's guarding guys that are bigger than him that just can dominate him. And then he's going against guys on the other end that the same thing, bigger. And that was the problem. Sean Stewart also just very athletic, but the basketball IQ and some of the basketball skills are not where you thought they would be for a former 5-star kid in his second year in college basketball. I think he's been able to get by on that athleticism through high school and hasn't always had to develop some of the stuff that other guys do. And, that cost him at Duke, and it cost him this season. I say played a lot, but, the fouls are things that you have to clean that up. And he just couldn't throughout the whole season. I think he fouled out of 7 or 8 games. That just can't happen because you put your team in a bad situation. So I think there was a mistake bringing in those two guys, not solely because they were former 5-star guys or they went to Duke or Kentucky. But, I think you need to find the right guys. And it didn't make sense to me from the beginning. And if you remember back when the transfer portal stuff was happening with basketball, whether you read it, I think I talked about it on here, but on the front row, our message board, I didn't think this made sense roster wise. And then you bring in a guy like Michi. Now, I did not expect Michi to just disappear for most of the season. And we'll hope that the full story comes out on that at some point. But, this was a guy who left Ohio State for a reason. And yes, he had a good year last season or 2 seasons ago now, I guess, at South Carolina. But that's a very different offense. He's a high volume shooter, which I guess in theory, Ohio State would like to shoot a lot of threes, but it wasn't like he was an efficient 3-point shooter. I think that there's obviously Jake Diebler has a relationship with Michi Johnson. He's an Ohio kid. It would have been a great story had it worked. It wasn't working before he left the team for personal reasons. He was playing poorly. You could see at times that it just wasn't working out there. And then that forces a guy like John Mobley Jr. to have to play more. Don't forget Tyson Chapman tore his ACL before the season, so you lose a promising guard there. You have to bring in a guy like Quest Glover, who's battled injuries throughout his whole career and just never was right for this team or at this level. So for me, the biggest thing that I think Jake Diebler and his staff will have to learn, and I do wonder if you try and find a bit more experience for the staff, but is this roster construction and, not going after maybe names or find guys that you recruited, things like that. But I think it was a kind of a doomed project from the beginning. And Steve Hellwagon and I had, I won't say this argument, but this discussion before the season. And, I'll admit when I get things wrong. This one I got, excuse me, cheers. This one I got spot on. And, I'll pat myself on the back for that. I wish I was wrong because it would have been way more fun to cover a lot more wins and, a deep run in the Big Ten tournament and an NCAA tournament. But there were just too many flaws in this group. On top, and you weren't building on a roster that was already really good anyway, right? Like you're adding to guys like Evan Mahaffey, good player, probably not playing much on a top end Big Ten team. Penn State and Ohio State haven't been that. But I love his hustle. He's an Ohio kid. He cares. That matters to some degree. It's good to have those guys. So you started kind of at the bottom after last season with the roster, and you don't get much better, I think. And just roster construction wise, I didn't think it made sense. And then there were too many games that you lose late. There were a lot of games this team was in that if they go the other way, you're talking about a team in the top half of the Big Ten and a team that wasn't worried about being on the bubble at the end of the season and whatnot. And some of that goes on coaching for sure and learning moments for Jake Diebler and his staff. But a lot of it goes on the players too. And Bruce Thornton, hell of a guard, had some big misses, had some strange plays in crunch time, also made some really big plays. I don't want to take away, but we're talking about, why this didn't go right. So I think that's something that everyone has to learn from to kind of get over the hump there. Say what you will about Jake Diebler. He's coming back next year. Ross Bjork is confident in him. He said this recently during an appearance on 97.1 The Fan. If he can keep recruiting well and he can get these transfer portal guys right, I think you have something because I do, when you talk basketball with Jake Diebler, you listen to Jake Diebler talk basketball, you get it. And, I know a lot of people have called him Holtman 2.0 and all this stuff. And I don't think that's fair. They do a lot of things differently, and I think if Jake can get the right guys in to run that, faster pace, more shots, you're not getting bogged down with the ball in the perimeter, which I know Ohio State fans like to point to. That's a lot of what college basketball is in the half court. You don't have elite players, so you pass the ball around until you find something. But you can prevent that by getting out in transition and doing some of the things that the Buckeyes did at the end of last year. So that's my rant on the basketball team. I think that there does need to be some significant changes again this offseason, and it needs to be different than last offseason because I don't think that went well, and it put this team in a tough position going into the year. And that was always my thought. So we'll wrap it up with that. This was another good one. We start spring practice next week. We get to watch the first hour of the first practice on Monday. So we'll have a lot of stuff out of that. And then we're rolling in spring. And, we'll be out there quite a bit talking to coaches, talking to players. So stay tuned to Bucknuts. Thank you guys for tuning into this. I always appreciate it. Like, subscribe, all that stuff. It helps us all out. And we'll talk to you next week, Buckeye fans. Cheers.